Hello and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Rob Moulton, a partner in our London office. In this episode, part of a 10-part series complementing Latham's 10 key focus areas for UK regulated firms in 2024 report, we discuss ESG. And to do this, I'm joined by my colleagues from the London office, partner Nicola Higgs and associate Ella McGinn. Nicola, Ella, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks so much for having us. And this is a really interesting topic to get to chat about.
Thanks for having me, Rob. Looking forward to discussing with you and Nicola.
Nicola, let's start with greenwashing. What are the key risks and what do we see clients doing to try and help mitigate against them?
Yeah, greenwashing, definitely one of the hot topics this year. And one of the reasons we included it as a key theme in our 2024 UK Financial Services Update was because of the FCA's new rule on anti-greenwashing and the associated guidance applying to all UK authorised firms from the 31st of May. So it's a hot topic throughout the year, but particularly at the moment as firms are grappling with implementation of it. And in that context, lots of clients have been asking us, is this any different from the age-old FCA adage of, all communications must be fair, clear and not misleading, which is certainly a fair challenge. And whilst in principle, the concept of greenwashing is certainly the same, don't say misleading things or give a misleading impression about how a financial product will perform. It's really the wider ESG landscape and what's happening in that context that adds the layer of complexity to the topic of greenwashing. So Ella, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of your own legal projects.
Thanks, Nicola. So greenwashing risk has clearly become a key concern for both financial market participants and their clients over recent years, both at an entity level and a product level. And whilst market practices and standards are still developing, and Nicola just mentioned the FCA's rules, but we're concurrently seeing EU, APAC and the US agendas on greenwashing develop as well. It's inevitably going to be tricky to navigate as the players grapple with the lack of consistency in how ESG is defined and what it means to different people, coupled with the rate of regulatory change in this area, both in the UK and globally, which we'll come on to. And market participants will be keen to ensure that they can really stand behind the ESG commitments they're making, both at a corporate level, so when they're making corporate pronouncements or entity level disclosures about their ESG strategy, and also in the products that they're producing. And regulators have highlighted the importance of demonstrability when it comes to evidencing the accuracy of firms' green claims. And it could be really challenging to diligence sustainability and ESG claims. And that uncertainty gives rise to the greenwashing risks where those claims aren't made clearly or they're misrepresented or misunderstood. And it's particularly important for firms at the moment to be diligencing their product names, their underlying investments and marketing materials as far as they possibly can, both when products are initially offered and then on an ongoing basis, just to avoid and mitigate the risk of regulatory attention and other third-party greenwashing claims. So if we take the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation or the SFDR as an example, that was originally intended as a disclosure regime, and the rules do reflect that. But for example, Article 9 of SFDR outlines the disclosure requirements for funds with distinct sustainability objectives, where the majority of the portfolio consists of ESG-focused investments. And the SFDR then dictates the format of the disclosure for those investments. But in practice, actually, the SFDR has been construed as a labelling regime, but without the standards behind those labels to ensure consistency and rigour in terms of what a product with a particular SFDR classification actually offers to investors. And regulators elsewhere in the world, including the SEC in the US, have been probing fund managers to demonstrate that the use of the word sustainable in the context of the prescribed EU disclosure isn't misleading to investors over in the US. And so there's now a review underway to try and clarify the EU regime, which is both a review of the level 1 SFDR, but also the level 2 delegated regulation. And that's the one that contains the granular detail of the disclosures that have to be made under the SFDR and the templates that are used to do that. So we'd really hope that the new regulations coming in, such as the FCA's Sustainable Disclosure Requirements Regime, or SDR, which includes labelling, naming and marketing rules, and the regulation of ESG ratings providers, will help to mitigate some of these risks by providing more certainty and clarity around expectations for ESG products.
Ella, you talked a bit about the rate of regulatory change. Have you ever seen an area in your career that's gone from not existing to so high up the agenda in such a period of time?
It's certainly ramped up very quickly, and I think the nature of the space in that everyone's got a different idea of what ESG means and how that plays out when it enters into regulation means that we've seen a lot of material coming out on it the last couple of years.
And in particular from the FCA as a leader here, how much of a difference do you think the new FCA rules are going to make to the landscape in the UK?
So we've obviously had quite a bit coming out of the FCA in this space recently. And just as a reminder, the FCA's new SDR disclosure and labelling regime contains rules around the use of investment labels by UK asset managers for products that meets positive sustainability criteria. There's also naming and marketing rules for UK funds using sustainability terms but that don't qualify for one of the labels. And then, as Nicola mentioned earlier, we've also got the FCA's new anti-greenwashing rule that will apply to all UK FCA-regulated firms to ensure that sustainability-related claims are fair, clear and not misleading. And as part of that, there'll be consumer-facing disclosure requirements, product and entity-level disclosure requirements, and also requirements for UK distributors to ensure that the product-level information on ESG products is provided to retail investors in particular. And although the FCA disclosure and labelling requirements will apply only in the first instance to UK asset managers, and for them will represent a big move towards more standardisation and clarity around making ESG commitments, I think other types of firms should also be looking at those standards to understand the direction of travel and regulatory expectations and how they can be effectively managing and mitigating greenwashing risk within their products. And then just on the FCA's anti-greenwashing rule, which provides an overlay to existing standards which were already set by the FCA on fair, clear and not misleading information. So, for example, the principles for business and the consumer duty, and also general consumer protection law and advertising rules, which would apply in the context of sustainability claims. There'll be some guidance from the FCA to help firms understand the FCA's expectations. But I think the new rule will represent a big step change in the ESG space to focus on sustainability claims in particular, and whether what a firm is holding itself out as doing is actually truly representative of the reality. So I think firms will need to make sure they've considered carefully how the anti-greenwashing rule might bite on their own activities and ensure they've got processes in place to comply with that rule.
And I'd add one extra overlay onto everything that Ella's just said, Rob, and it links back to your point really around, the timing and the pace of change. We're sitting here in 2024 where the rules that we've been watching consulted on and proposed in the UK over the last couple of years are going to start to come into fruition. There's now meaningful implementation work to be done in the UK, but the timing is interesting because the FCA is implementing for those final rules a good number of years after watching the equivalent European regime. It's seen what's worked, it's seen what hasn't worked, it's been refining its thinking. The industry has helped it refine its thinking on what should be workable for firms to comply with from the outset. So we may see a little bit less of the European approach of we'll implement some pretty ambitious rules and then, we'll allow firms a number of years to improve disclosure standards on ESG over time, and we'll keep giving them supervisory guidance on how to do that. I think the FCA could be a little bit more intrusive, both as a supervisor and through its enforcement teams, on the robustness of green claims and compliance with the new greenwashing rule. And so having the rules come into effect now will provide an additional lever for its enforcement team in bringing those actions. And we've already seen some keen interest from the FCA's enforcement team on some of the existing ESG claims that are in the market.
mean, that's interesting. Enforcement is almost a full circle, I guess, of a new idea with new rules, with people grappling with it. When you get to that, we're interested in enforcement. What about the global trends, Nicola, for 2024? What should people be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we often think about advising on ESG, both in terms of, what is the detail of the particular new law that we're providing on, but also just what is the ESG landscape that we are providing that advice on and implementing those rules in the context of. And there's a number of trends coming through in 2024 on the broader ESG landscape that, track across a number of different jurisdictions that we think firms should be mindful of. The first of those is the transition from soft law to hard law. In essence, what that means is moving from, voluntary comply or explain standards in the ESG landscape to hard law, legislative rules, firm disclosure requirements. A good example of that would be the UK will consult this year on a regime for listed companies, and it's likely therefore to move the regime for listed companies from voluntary TCFD compliance towards more mandatory ISSB standards. Obviously, in Europe, we've got CSRD coming into force, another format for enterprise level disclosures requiring incredibly comprehensive, wide-ranging enterprise level disclosures across a whole range of the E, S, and G metrics. So hard law, strong implementation work is certainly a key theme of 2024, and teams will be kept very busy and need to be very well resourced to handle that level of implementation. And that leads really to another trend that we're seeing. And on the one hand, that is convergence of ESG standards. If you're asking firms to report on their ESG performance at enterprise level, at group level, then it's really complicated for them to do that if there are different reporting standards in the different jurisdictions in which they operate. So the ISSB standard, it's the standard that the UK is planning to base its legislative regime on, is something that has been produced as international best practice, and the UK is very keen to align with international best practice in that context, but also recognise that a number of firms in London are having to comply with regimes in other parts of the world, and it wants, as a regulator and as a policymaker, to be helpful to those global multinationals operating in London. That is in contrast to some of the other enterprise level disclosure hard law that we're seeing. So CSRD in the EU is very much a kind of European specific outlier with rather extensive extraterritorial impact for any multinationals that have got significant EU presence. And so they may find their head offices outside the EU being impacted by EU disclosure standards because of the extraterritorial nature of that. But the EU is not alone in its visions on extraterritoriality. We're seeing laws elsewhere in the world. The state of California has its own climate disclosure rule, which can have effect in other jurisdictions. So both convergence and at the same time divergence in the context of some of this extraterritorial leakage of rules is something that is going to be particularly complex to navigate for firms. A couple of other trends that we'd call out. ESG data has been the trend for a number of years now in the context of the ESG transition. So for the first time, we're starting to see the hard law come in on that, both in the EU and the UK, specifically to regulate ESG ratings providers. Regulators have long been concerned about the amount of capital flows tracking ESG ratings, and therefore the importance of those ratings having integrity from a data perspective and being able to regulate the use of those ratings. And so there'll be rather wide-ranging impacts as a result of the regulation of ESG ratings over the course of the next year or two. And then also supply chains. Supply chains has been a really hot topic for a while now. These are the legal rules that propose that you have to exert pressure on your supply chains to meet higher ESG standards to help you perform well from an ESG perspective as a company. An incredibly difficult thing to do and a stressful obligation to place on companies, particularly given their supply chains may be based, again, in other jurisdictions that aren't subject to such stringent rules. So the EU policy and the rulebook on supply chains is really struggling actually to finally make it through at the moment because a lot of political pushback on the issue. But at the same time, we're seeing certain local regimes like Germany implement for their own rules on supply chains. And the one other point I'd mention, just to wrap up our discussion, is the counter to the greenwashing agenda that we're seeing in the UK is really the green hushing agenda we're seeing particularly in the US. And so sitting in a seat in London, ESG is very much on the radar. Strong, fast, efficient progress on ESG is on the radar of most of our UK, European governments and regulators. Not so the case in the US, where various state-level policy is pushing back on the ESG agenda. So a lot of our multinational clients are really having to navigate what the UK regulator is imposing on them here versus some of the pressures they're receiving politically elsewhere in the world.
Well, thanks both. And what an interesting combination of a dynamic political and a dynamic regulatory landscape all at the same time. It's been great to talk to you about it.
Thanks, Rob. That's exactly right. A lot to work through on the ESG front this year.
Thanks, Rob. It's been great to be here. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of our podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast or to access our 10 Key Focus Areas report, please visit the links located in the show description.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.